In the dusty streets of Afghanistan, where danger lurks behind every corner and survival depends on split-second decisions, nobody expected a simple cleaning woman to become the unlikely hero of one of the most intense firefights of the war. What started as an ordinary morning routine would transform into a life-or-death situation that would test the limits of human courage and reveal that heroism often comes from the most unexpected places. This is the true story of Amira Hassan, a 34-year-old Afghan woman whose only weapon was a broom until a Navy SEAL thrust his rifle into her trembling hands and whispered words that would echo through her mind forever. Today, you're not just sweeping floors. Today, you're saving lives. What happened next would challenge everything you think you know about war, courage, and the extraordinary strength that ordinary people discover when faced with impossible choices. This is not just a story about survival. This is a story about how one woman's determination to protect the innocent turned a routine cleaning job into a mission that would haunt and inspire everyone who witnessed it. Get ready for a journey that will take you into the heart of combat, where the line between civilian and soldier disappears, and where a mother's love becomes the most powerful weapon of all. Amira Hassan had been sweeping the same concrete floors for 3 years, and she knew every crack, every stain, every worn patch by heart. The military compound in Helmand province had become as familiar to her as her own small home in the village nearby. At 34, she had learned to move quietly through the American base, her presence barely noticed by the soldiers who came and went like shadows in the early morning light. The broom felt comfortable in her weathered hands as she worked her way through the main corridor of the operations building. Her hijab was pulled tight against the morning chill, and her worn sandals made soft shuffling sounds against the floor. She had started this job not out of choice, but out of desperate necessity. After her husband was killed in a roadside bombing 2 years earlier, Amira was left to care for her 3 young children and her aging mother-in-law. The American base paid well for local workers, and, despite the risks, she couldn't afford to refuse the income. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson was the first to notice something was wrong. He had been walking through the corridor on his way to the morning briefing when he saw Amira freeze in the middle of her sweeping. Her dark eyes were fixed on something outside the window, and the color had drained from her face. Marcus followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. 3 pickup trucks were approaching the main gate at high speed, black flags flying from their antennas. The distinctive markings were unmistakable. Taliban fighters, and they weren't here for a peaceful visit. Marcus grabbed his radio and barked out the alert code, but even as he spoke, the sharp crack of automatic gunfire erupted from the perimeter. The attack had begun with ruthless precision, timed perfectly for the early morning when many soldiers were either sleeping or just beginning their day. The compound's alarm system wailed to life, but it was too late. The enemy was already at the gates. Amira dropped her broom and pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering in her chest. She had lived through attacks before, had seen what these fighters could do to anyone they considered a collaborator. Working for the Americans had painted a target on her back, but she had hoped her low profile would keep her safe. Now, as bullets began to shatter the windows around her, she realized how foolish that hope had been. Marcus was already moving, his training kicking in despite the chaos erupting around them. He could hear shouts from other parts of the building as his fellow soldiers responded to the attack, but he also knew they were caught off guard. The Taliban had chosen their timing well. Many of the base's defenders were scattered throughout the compound, and it would take precious minutes for them to organize a coordinated response. The building shook as an explosion rocked the eastern wall. Amira cried out and ducked lower, fragments of concrete raining down around her. Through the broken window, she could see the Taliban fighters advancing in disciplined formations, their faces covered by dark masks, their weapons firing with deadly accuracy at anyone who showed themselves. Marcus made a split-second decision that would change both their lives forever. Instead of leaving Amira to fend for herself while he joined the defensive effort, he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the supply room at the end of the corridor. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. Amira looked at him with wide, frightened eyes, not understanding his English but recognizing the urgency in his tone. The supply room was small and windowless, filled with cleaning materials and maintenance equipment. Marcus thought it would be the safest place for her to wait out the attack, but as they reached the door, another explosion sent them both sprawling. This one was closer, much closer, and, when Marcus looked up, he saw that part of the ceiling had collapsed, blocking their escape route. They were trapped in a section of the building that was rapidly becoming a killing zone. Through the damaged walls, Marcus could see Taliban fighters moving through the compound with practiced efficiency. They were sweeping through the buildings methodically, searching for anyone left behind. He knew they had perhaps minutes before the fighters reached their location. Amira was speaking rapidly in Pashto, her voice tight with fear. Marcus didn't need to understand the words to know she was praying. He had seen enough combat to recognize the look in her eyes, the way people's faces changed when they realized death was approaching. But Marcus also saw something else in Amira's expression, something that gave him hope. Beneath the fear was a fierce determination, a mother's resolve that refused to break even in the face of overwhelming odds. He had learned enough about her over the months to know she wasn't just fighting for her own life. She had children waiting for her at home, a family that depended on her survival. The sound of boots in the corridor grew louder. Marcus checked his weapon and peered around the corner. 3 Taliban fighters were moving toward their position, searching each room systematically. They were well armed and moved with the confidence of men who believed they had already won. Marcus realized he was facing an impossible choice. He could try to fight his way out alone, leaving Amira to face whatever fate awaited her, or he could stay and try to protect her, knowing that doing so might doom them both. His training told him to prioritize his own survival, to escape and rejoin the defensive effort. But, looking at this woman who had shown such quiet courage day after day, working in a dangerous place to feed her family, he found he couldn't abandon her. The decision crystallized in his mind with startling clarity. He turned to Amira and saw that she was watching him, waiting to see what he would do. In that moment, he realized she understood the situation better than he had given her credit for. She knew they were trapped, knew the fighters were coming, and she was prepared to face whatever happened with dignity. Marcus made a choice that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. He looked directly into Amira's eyes and held out his rifle. "You know how to use this?" he asked, then realized she might not understand. He mimed the action of firing, pointing the weapon toward the corridor where the footsteps were growing closer. Amira stared at the rifle for a long moment, then looked back at his face. She said something in Pashto, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Marcus didn't understand the words, but he heard the resolve in her tone. She reached out and took the weapon with hands that barely trembled. What happened next would become legend among the soldiers who served at that base, a story told and retold in mess halls and barracks around the world. But, for Marcus and Amira, huddled in that damaged building with death approaching from the corridor, it was simply the moment when 2 people from different worlds discovered they shared the same unbreakable determination to survive. The Taliban fighters were getting closer, their voices echoing off the concrete walls as they called out to each other in harsh whispers. Marcus could hear them checking each room, getting nearer with each passing second. He looked at Amira one more time, this ordinary woman who cleaned floors for a living, and saw something extraordinary in her expression. She was no longer just a civilian caught in a war zone. She was a fighter, armed and ready to defend not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she could protect. The transformation was remarkable to witness, as if Marcus was seeing the real Amira for the first time, the woman beneath the quiet exterior who had survived years of conflict and loss without breaking. The footsteps stopped just outside their hiding place. Marcus held his breath and saw Amira do the same, the rifle steady in her hands despite having never fired one before. They both knew that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died, whether Amira's children would see their mother again, whether Marcus would make it back to his family in Ohio. In the silence before the storm, as they waited for the Taliban fighters to discover their location, Marcus found himself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. A cleaning woman and a soldier, thrown together by circumstances beyond their control, about to make their stand in a supply room filled with mops and maintenance equipment. It wasn't how he had imagined his war would end, but, looking at Amira's determined face, Marcus realized it might be exactly how it was meant to begin. The first Taliban fighter appeared in the doorway like a shadow made flesh. His face was covered by a dark mask, leaving only his eyes visible, but those eyes held a coldness that made Amira's blood freeze. He carried his weapon with the casual confidence of someone who had used it many times before, and, when he saw them huddled in the corner, his lips curved into what might have been a smile beneath the fabric. Marcus felt time slow to a crawl as he watched the fighter's finger move toward the trigger. In that suspended moment, he saw his entire life flash before his eyes, not in images but in feelings. The weight of regret for things left unsaid, love unexpressed, promises unfulfilled. But, more than his own mortality, he found himself thinking about Amira's children, 3 young faces he had never seen but could imagine clearly, waiting at home for a mother who might never return. Then, Amira fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The Taliban fighter dropped instantly, his weapon clattering across the concrete floor. Amira held the rifle steady, her fingers still on the trigger, her dark eyes wide with shock at what she had just done. Marcus stared at her in amazement. She had never fired a weapon before in her life, had probably never even held one until he placed it in her hands moments earlier. Yet her shot had been true, driven by an instinct for survival that transcended training or experience. In that instant, the quiet cleaning woman had transformed into something else entirely, something fierce and protective and absolutely deadly. The second fighter appeared before either of them could fully process what had happened. This one was more cautious, having heard the gunshot, but he clearly hadn't expected resistance from what he assumed would be helpless civilians. Amira didn't hesitate. She fired again, the rifle kicking against her shoulder with brutal force, but she held on and found her target. Marcus scrambled to retrieve the fallen fighter's weapons, his hands shaking with adrenaline as he checked the corridor for more enemies. The building had gone strangely quiet after the gunshots, as if the entire compound was holding its breath. He could hear distant explosions and the rattle of automatic fire from other parts of the base, but their immediate area seemed temporarily clear. "We need to move," Marcus said, then realized Amira wouldn't understand. He gestured toward the corridor, miming movement with his hands. She nodded, understanding crossing her face despite the language barrier. They both knew they couldn't stay in the supply room. Other fighters would come looking for their missing comrades, and, when they did, they would be better prepared. Amira stood slowly, still clutching the rifle. Marcus could see the shock beginning to set in, the way her hands trembled slightly as the reality of what she had done started to penetrate. She had killed 2 men in less than a minute, men who would have murdered her without hesitation, but taking a life was never easy regardless of the circumstances. They moved carefully into the corridor, stepping over the bodies of the fallen fighters. Marcus led the way, weapon ready, while Amira followed close behind. The building was a maze of damaged walls and debris, made more treacherous by the morning shadows that could hide additional enemies. As they reached the main corridor, they heard voices speaking in rapid Pashto. More fighters were in the building, searching for survivors. Marcus estimated at least 4 distinct voices, possibly more. He looked back at Amira and saw that she was listening intently, her face pale but focused. She said something in a low whisper, then seemed to realize he wouldn't understand. She held up her hand, fingers spread, then made a cutting motion across her throat. 5 fighters, and they were planning to kill anyone they found. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. These weren't soldiers looking for military targets. They were executioners, here to send a message written in blood. The voices were getting closer, and Marcus realized they were trapped again. The main exit was blocked by rubble from the earlier explosion, and the only other way out would take them directly past the searching fighters. They needed a miracle, or at least a very good plan. That's when Amira surprised him again. She pointed to a ventilation grate near the floor, then to herself. She was small enough to fit through the opening, could potentially crawl through the building's air system to reach safety. Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. It was her best chance, possibly her only chance. But Amira shook her head firmly when he gestured for her to go. Instead, she pointed to the grate, then to both of them. She wasn't leaving without him. The determination in her eyes was absolute, leaving no room for argument. This woman who barely knew him, who had every reason to save herself, was refusing to abandon him to face the fighters alone. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a recognition of courage that transcended nationality or language. He had served with career soldiers who wouldn't have shown half the bravery that this civilian woman was displaying. She had already saved both their lives with her quick action in the supply room, and now she was risking everything to ensure they both made it out alive. The ventilation system was their only option, but Marcus was too large to fit through most of the openings. They would have to find another route, and they would have to find it quickly. The voices in the corridor were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of doors being kicked open as the fighters searched each room systematically. Amira tugged on his sleeve and pointed upward. Above them, a section of the ceiling had partially collapsed, creating an opening to the floor above. It was a dangerous climb, especially while carrying weapons, but it might be their only chance to escape the search pattern of the fighters below. Marcus boosted Amira up first, marveling at her agility as she pulled herself through the opening despite never having done anything like it before. She reached down to help pull him up, her small hands surprisingly strong as she gripped his wrists. They found themselves in what had been an office, now devastated by the explosion that had damaged the ceiling. Through the broken windows, they could see the full scope of the attack. The compound was under assault from multiple directions, with Taliban fighters advancing through the defensive perimeter while others moved through the buildings like the ones hunting them below. American soldiers were fighting back from fortified positions, but they were clearly outnumbered and struggling to coordinate their response. Amira moved to the window and studied the scene below with intense concentration. Marcus watched as she seemed to be calculating distances and angles, planning something he couldn't quite understand. When she turned back to him, her expression had changed again. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, something that looked almost like anger. She spoke in Pashto, her voice low and urgent, then seemed to remember he couldn't understand. She pointed to herself, then to her chest over her heart, then made a motion that clearly indicated children. She was thinking about her family, about what these fighters would do to them if they discovered she had killed their comrades. Marcus realized that Amira wasn't just fighting for her immediate survival anymore. She was fighting for her future, for her children's future, for the right to live without fear in her own land. The transformation was complete now. The woman who had been sweeping floors that morning was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes survival requires more than just hiding and hoping for rescue. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them both freeze. The fighters had discovered their escape route and were coming after them. Marcus checked his ammunition and saw that he was running low. The weapons they had taken from the dead fighters would help, but they were still vastly outnumbered. Amira seemed to sense his thoughts. She looked at him directly, her dark eyes filled with a calm determination that was somehow more frightening than any rage he had ever seen. She said something in Pashto, her tone suggesting a question. When he looked confused, she repeated the gesture she had made earlier, pointing the rifle toward the stairs where their pursuers were approaching. Marcus understood. She was asking if they were going to fight or try to run. Looking at her face, seeing the absolute resolve there, he realized there was really only one answer. They had come too far to surrender now, had already crossed too many lines to turn back. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, this unlikely partnership between a soldier and a cleaning woman who had discovered she was much more than anyone had ever imagined. The footsteps on the stairs grew louder, and Marcus knew their time was running out. He looked at Amira one more time and saw his own determination reflected in her eyes. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were fighting for something much more important than their own lives, something worth dying for if necessary. The first fighter appeared at the top of the stairs, weapon raised and ready. But this time, he wasn't facing helpless civilians. This time, he was facing two people who had discovered that ordinary courage, when pushed to its limits, could become something extraordinary. The firefight that erupted in that devastated office would become the stuff of military legend, but, for Marcus and Amira, it was simply a desperate struggle for survival that seemed to stretch on forever. The Taliban fighters came up the stairs in a disciplined assault formation, but they had not expected to face organized resistance from what their intelligence had suggested would be a soft target. Amira had positioned herself behind an overturned desk, the rifle steady in her hands despite the chaos erupting around them. She fired with careful precision, not wasting ammunition on wild shots but waiting for clear targets before squeezing the trigger. Marcus watched in amazement as she adapted to combat with an instinct that seemed almost supernatural. Each shot found its mark, each movement was calculated to maximize their defensive advantage. The first wave of fighters fell back after losing 2 more men to Amira's unexpected marksmanship. Marcus could hear them regrouping on the stairs, speaking in urgent whispers as they tried to understand how a simple cleaning operation had turned into a deadly ambush. He used the brief lull to reload and check their ammunition situation. They were running dangerously low, and he knew they couldn't hold this position much longer. Amira seemed to reach the same conclusion. She pointed to another collapsed section of ceiling that led to what appeared to be an equipment room on the 3rd floor. It was another dangerous climb, but staying where they were meant certain death once the fighters organized a proper assault. The sound of boots on the stairs told them their time was up. This time, the fighters were more cautious, using smoke grenades to obscure their approach and coordinating their advance with military precision. Marcus realized these weren't just local insurgents. These were experienced fighters, possibly foreign volunteers with real training. They made it to the 3rd floor just as the office below erupted in gunfire. The fighters were shooting at shadows now, pumping round after round into the empty room where their targets had been moments before. Marcus could hear frustrated shouts as they discovered the escape route, followed by the inevitable sounds of pursuit. The equipment room was filled with maintenance machinery and electrical panels, creating a maze of hiding spots and potential defensive positions. But it was also a dead end. There were no more floors above them, no more escape routes to explore. If they were going to make their final stand, it would be here. Amira moved through the machinery with surprising familiarity, and Marcus realized she had probably cleaned this room countless times during her years working at the base. She knew every piece of equipment, every corner where shadows fell, every sightline that could provide an advantage. What had been routine knowledge for a cleaning woman was now tactical intelligence for a fighter. She led him to a position behind a large generator that provided good cover while offering clear fields of fire toward the only entrance. As they settled into their defensive position, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices outside the building, speaking in Pashto, coordinating what sounded like a much larger assault. Amira listened intently, her face growing pale as she processed what she was hearing. She turned to Marcus and held up her hands, fingers spread wide. 10. Then, she made a slashing motion across her throat. 10 more fighters were surrounding the building, preparing to finish what their advance team had started. Marcus felt despair creeping into his thoughts for the first time since the attack began. 12 armed fighters against 2 people with limited ammunition and no backup. The math was brutal and unforgiving. Even if they fought perfectly, even if every shot found its mark, they probably wouldn't have enough bullets to stop the assault. That's when Amira did something that changed everything. She reached into her hijab and pulled out a small photograph, looking at it for a long moment before showing it to Marcus. 3 children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 12, smiled back at the camera with the innocent joy that only children could possess. Her children, the reason she got up every morning, the future she was fighting to protect. She spoke in Pashto, her voice soft but filled with fierce determination. Marcus didn't understand the words, but he heard the love in her tone, the absolute refusal to surrender that came from a mother's heart. She tucked the photograph back into her hijab and checked her weapon one more time. Whatever happened next, she would face it knowing she had done everything possible to return to those 3 young faces. The first fighters appeared in the doorway like ghosts materializing from the darkness. They moved with professional skill, using the machinery for cover as they advanced into the room. Amira and Marcus opened fire simultaneously, their weapons adding their voices to the deadly conversation that filled the air with lead and death. The battle that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his military career. It was close-quarters combat at its most brutal, with no room for error and no second chances. The fighters advanced methodically, using their numerical advantage to pressure the defenders from multiple angles. But they had underestimated both the tactical value of Amira's intimate knowledge of the room and the devastating effect of fighting people who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Amira moved through the machinery like a ghost, appearing to fire from one position before vanishing and reappearing somewhere else entirely. She used every piece of equipment as both cover and concealment, turning her years of cleaning experience into a masterclass in urban warfare. The fighters couldn't pin her down, couldn't predict where the next shot would come from. Marcus found himself trying to keep up with her, marveling at the transformation he was witnessing. The quiet, almost invisible woman who had swept floors in the background of military life had become a force of nature, a deadly opponent who fought with the combined fury of every mother who had ever lost a child to violence. But the fighters were learning, adapting their tactics to counter her mobility. They began using coordinated advances to limit her movement options, forcing her to stay in positions longer than was safe. Marcus saw the trap they were setting and knew they had perhaps minutes before the tactical situation became impossible. That's when they heard the explosion outside. It was different from the combat sounds they had been hearing, deeper and more sustained. Through the broken windows, Marcus could see flames rising from one of the Taliban vehicles. American air support had finally arrived, and the fighters besieging the compound were coming under attack from above. The effect on the fighters in the room was immediate. Voices outside began shouting in panic as their assault turned into a retreat. The men advancing through the machinery hesitated, torn between completing their mission and escaping before the airstrikes found them. Amira didn't hesitate. She used their momentary confusion to launch a counterattack that caught them completely off guard. Moving with lethal precision, she eliminated 2 fighters who had exposed themselves while trying to communicate with their forces outside. Her shots were clean and professional, the work of someone who had discovered a talent she never knew she possessed. Marcus joined the counterattack, and together they drove the remaining fighters back toward the entrance. The tide of battle had turned in their favor, but they both knew it was temporary. The air support would eventually have to leave, and when it did, more fighters would come. The Taliban didn't give up easily, and they had suffered too many casualties to let this insult go unanswered. As the immediate threat receded, Marcus found himself looking at Amira with something approaching awe. She stood among the machinery like a warrior queen, her hijab slightly disheveled but her rifle steady in her hands. There was no triumph in her expression, only the grim satisfaction of someone who had done what was necessary to protect what mattered most. The sound of helicopters grew louder outside, and Marcus realized that rescue might actually be possible. American forces were mounting a counterattack, trying to retake the compound and evacuate any survivors. But getting to the helicopters would mean running through a gauntlet of fighters who were now desperate and angry, pushed beyond rational tactics into the realm of pure vengeance. Amira seemed to understand the situation without needing explanation. She checked her ammunition one more time and looked toward the stairs where their escape route lay. The determination in her eyes hadn't wavered, but Marcus could see the toll the fighting was taking on her. She was exhausted, running on adrenaline and maternal instinct, but she wasn't ready to quit. The helicopters were getting closer, and with them came the sound of renewed fighting throughout the compound. This was their chance, possibly their only chance, to break free from the building that had become their fortress and their prison. But it would require one more desperate gamble, one final test of the partnership that had transformed a routine morning into an epic struggle for survival. Marcus looked at Amira one more time, this remarkable woman who had proven that heroes could emerge from the most unexpected places. She met his gaze steadily, and, in her dark eyes, he saw the reflection of his own determination. They had come too far to fail now, had fought too hard to surrender when rescue was within reach. Together, they began their descent toward freedom, toward a future that neither of them could have imagined when the sun rose that morning. Behind them lay the evidence of what ordinary people could accomplish when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Ahead lay an uncertain path through a battlefield where death waited behind every corner. But they were no longer the same people who had hidden in a supply room just hours before. They had been transformed by combat, by the discovery that survival sometimes requires becoming something more than you ever thought possible. As they moved toward the sound of rescue helicopters, Marcus knew that whatever happened next, he would never forget the lesson Amira had taught him about the true nature of courage. The stairwell was a death trap waiting to spring. Marcus could hear movement on every floor below them as Taliban fighters repositioned for what they clearly intended to be a final assault. The airstrikes had disrupted their initial plan, but these were experienced fighters who knew how to adapt under pressure. They were now hunting with the focused intensity of predators who had tasted blood and wanted more. Amira moved down the stairs like a ghost, her feet finding the quiet spots on each step with the unconscious skill of someone who had navigated these same stairs thousands of times before. She paused at each landing, listening intently to the sounds filtering up from below. Marcus marveled at how completely she had embraced her transformation from civilian to warrior. Every movement was calculated, every decision filtered through the tactical awareness she had developed during their desperate fight for survival. At the second-floor landing, she held up a closed fist, the universal signal to stop. Marcus froze behind her, straining to hear what had caught her attention. Voices were speaking in urgent whispers just around the corner, and, from the tone, it was clear they were coordinating an ambush. The fighters had anticipated their escape route and were waiting for them to walk into a trap. Amira turned to face Marcus, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of frustration and determination. She pointed to herself, then made a circling motion with her finger. She was suggesting a flanking maneuver, using her knowledge of the building's layout to approach the ambush from an unexpected direction. Marcus understood immediately, but the idea terrified him. It would mean splitting up, and, after everything they had been through together, the thought of losing her felt unbearable. But he also recognized the tactical soundness of her plan. These fighters were expecting two people to come down the stairs together. They wouldn't be prepared for a coordinated attack from multiple directions. Amira knew the building better than anyone, could move through areas that the fighters might not even know existed. It was their best chance, possibly their only chance. Marcus nodded reluctantly, and Amira's face broke into the first smile he had seen from her since the attack began. It was fierce and predatory, the expression of someone who had discovered she was very good at something she had never imagined doing. She disappeared around a corner with the silent grace of a hunting cat, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the weight of what they were about to attempt. The sound of helicopters outside was growing louder, but Marcus knew that time was working against them. The longer they took to reach the extraction point, the more likely it became that the Taliban would succeed in organizing an effective defense. These fighters had probably studied American rescue protocols, knew exactly how long they had before the helicopters would be forced to leave without their passengers. Marcus positioned himself at the top of the stairs and waited for Amira's signal. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. She would attack the ambush from behind while he provided supporting fire from above. If it worked, they would break through the fighters' defensive line and reach the ground floor. If it failed, they would both die in a stairwell that would become their tomb. The signal came in the form of gunfire from somewhere below and to the left. Amira had found her flanking route and was engaging the ambush team from their blind side. Marcus immediately began his descent, firing at any target that presented itself. The fighters were caught completely off guard, spinning between two directions of attack and unable to coordinate their response effectively. The firefight that followed was brutal but brief. Caught in a crossfire they hadn't expected, the Taliban fighters were eliminated with clinical efficiency. Marcus found Amira reloading behind an overturned table, her face grim but satisfied. She had taken a graze across her left arm, but the wound was superficial. More importantly, their path to the ground floor was now clear. But, as they reached the main corridor, they discovered that their problems were far from over. Through the shattered windows, they could see that the compound's main courtyard had become a battlefield. American forces were fighting to establish a secure landing zone for the rescue helicopters, but Taliban fighters were contesting every inch of ground. Explosions lit up the morning sky as rocket-propelled grenades and mortar rounds turned the space into a hellscape of smoke and flying debris. Amira studied the scene with the tactical eye she had developed during their ordeal. The direct route to the landing zone was suicide. Too much open ground, too many shooters with clear fields of fire. They needed another way, a path that would use the compound's infrastructure to provide cover and concealment. She pointed to a series of concrete barriers that formed a zigzag pattern across the courtyard. They were blast walls designed to channel vehicle traffic and provide protection against car bombs, but they could also serve as cover for two people trying to reach a helicopter. It would mean a dangerous sprint across open ground, with death waiting at every corner, but it was better than walking straight into a firing squad.
Marcus checked his remaining ammunition and felt his stomach drop.
3 rounds left, plus whatever was in the weapons they had taken from dead fighters. Against unknown numbers of enemy combatants, it might as well have been empty. He looked at Amira and saw that she had reached the same conclusion. They were about to attempt the most dangerous part of their escape with almost no ammunition and no backup plan. The helicopters were close now, so close that Marcus could see the door gunners scanning for targets. American soldiers were advancing across the courtyard, using the same blast walls that Amira had identified as their route to safety. But the Taliban fighters were making them pay for every yard of progress, and the casualties were mounting on both sides. Amira grabbed Marcus's arm and pointed to something that made his heart race. A group of Taliban fighters was setting up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher behind one of the blast walls, preparing to target the approaching helicopters. If they succeeded, the rescue mission would become a catastrophe that would claim the lives of everyone aboard the aircraft. Without hesitation, Amira began moving toward the fighters, using the blast walls for cover as she had planned. But, instead of heading directly for the landing zone, she was intercepting the RPG team, putting herself between them and their target. Marcus realized what she was doing and felt a mixture of admiration and terror. She was willing to sacrifice her own escape to prevent a massacre. Marcus followed her, knowing that this was the moment that would define both their lives forever. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were actively fighting to save others, putting themselves in harm's way to protect people they had never met. The transformation from victims to heroes was now complete. The Taliban fighters were so focused on their attack that they never saw Amira approaching from their flank. Her first shot took down the man operating the launcher, while Marcus eliminated the spotter with his second-to-last round. But there were more fighters than they had anticipated, and the element of surprise was lost almost immediately. What followed was the most intense firefight of their entire ordeal. Pinned down behind inadequate cover, facing multiple enemies with superior positions, they fought with the desperate fury of people who knew they were probably about to die. But they also fought with the knowledge that every second they held the fighters' attention was another second for the helicopters to complete their mission. Amira's final shot eliminated the last of the RPG team just as her ammunition ran out. Marcus fired his last round a heartbeat later, dropping a fighter who had been moving to flank their position. They were now defenseless, armed with nothing but empty weapons and the will to survive. That's when the door gunner on the lead helicopter spotted them. The heavy machine gun opened up with a sound like thunder, sending a stream of bullets that forced the remaining Taliban fighters to dive for cover. The helicopter swung around to provide close support, its crew laying down suppressing fire that gave Marcus and Amira the chance they needed. They ran across the remaining open ground with bullets snapping past their heads and explosions erupting around their feet. The helicopter crew was already reaching out to pull them aboard when Marcus felt Amira stumble. She had been hit, blood spreading across her shirt, but she kept moving with the determination that had carried her through the entire ordeal. Marcus caught her as she collapsed at the helicopter's door, her strength finally failing after hours of superhuman effort. The crew chief grabbed both of them and hauled them into the aircraft, which immediately lifted off and banked away from the compound. Through the open door, Marcus could see the base falling behind them, smoke rising from dozens of fires that marked the site of their desperate struggle. Amira was unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. The medic worked over her with practiced efficiency, stopping the bleeding and stabilizing her condition. She would survive, Marcus realized with overwhelming relief. This remarkable woman who had saved his life and countless others would live to see her children again. As the helicopter carried them toward safety, Marcus found himself thinking about the morning that had changed everything. He had started the day as a soldier serving his tour of duty in a routine assignment. Amira had begun hers as a cleaning woman doing a job that paid enough to feed her family. Neither of them could have imagined the journey they would take together, the transformation they would undergo in the crucible of combat. But, perhaps most remarkably, Marcus realized that their story wasn't really about war at all. It was about the discovery that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. It was about the bonds that could form between strangers who found themselves fighting for something greater than their own survival. The compound disappeared behind them, but the memory of what had happened there would remain with both of them forever. They had entered that building as separate individuals from different worlds. They were leaving it as something else entirely, forever connected by the experience of discovering who they really were when everything else was stripped away. The field hospital at Bagram Air Base buzzed with controlled chaos as medical teams worked to save the wounded from the compound attack. Marcus sat beside Amira's bed, watching her sleep with the peaceful expression of someone who had finally found safety after walking through hell. The doctors had removed the bullet fragments from her shoulder and assured him that she would make a full recovery, but seeing her so still and vulnerable reminded him of just how close they had both come to death. 3 days had passed since the helicopter had carried them away from the burning compound. 3 days of debriefings, medical examinations, and the slow process of trying to make sense of what they had experienced together. Marcus had told the story so many times to so many different officers that the words had begun to feel mechanical, but the emotions behind them remained as raw and powerful as ever. The official reports would record the basic facts. A Taliban assault on a forward operating base had been repelled with minimal casualties thanks to the heroic actions of a Navy SEAL and an Afghan civilian employee. The enemy had suffered significant losses, including the destruction of their assault team and the capture of valuable intelligence materials. It was a victory by any military standard, a successful defense that would be studied in training manuals and staff colleges. But the dry language of official reports could never capture the human reality of what had happened in those desperate hours. They couldn't describe the moment when a cleaning woman had transformed into a warrior, or the instant when two strangers had discovered they were willing to die for each other. The paperwork would record the tactical details, but it would miss the soul of the story entirely. Amira stirred in her sleep, and Marcus leaned forward to check on her. The doctors had said she might sleep for hours yet, her body recovering from the trauma and exhaustion of their ordeal. But her vital signs were strong, and the color was returning to her face. She was going to be fine, and that knowledge filled Marcus with a relief so profound it left him feeling dizzy. Colonel Patterson, the base commander, had visited that morning to personally thank them both for their actions. He had explained that the intelligence gathered from the failed attack had already led to successful operations against Taliban leadership in the region. Their desperate fight for survival had apparently disrupted a much larger enemy plan, preventing attacks that could have claimed dozens of American and Afghan lives. The colonel had also brought news about Amira's family. Her children and mother-in-law had been evacuated from their village and were now under protective custody at a secure location. The Taliban would undoubtedly seek revenge against anyone who had opposed them so effectively, but the military had protocols for protecting Afghan allies and their families. They would be relocated to a safer area, possibly even resettled in America if Amira chose to accept that option. Marcus found himself thinking about those 3 children from the photograph Amira had shown him during their final stand. He had never met them, probably never would, but they had become important to him in a way he couldn't fully explain. They represented something pure and hopeful in a world that often seemed dominated by violence and hatred. Knowing they were safe felt almost as important as his own survival. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made Marcus look up. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the trauma surgeon who had operated on Amira, approached with the confident stride of someone who had spent years saving lives under the most difficult conditions. She checked Amira's chart, satisfied herself that everything was progressing normally, then turned her attention to Marcus. "You should get some sleep," she said, not for the first time. "Your friend is going to be fine, but you look like you're about to collapse. When was the last time you actually rested?" Marcus couldn't remember. The last 3 days had passed in a blur of adrenaline and anxiety, punctuated by brief periods of unconsciousness that couldn't really be called sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he found himself back in that building, reliving moments when split-second decisions had meant the difference between life and death. The doctors called it a normal stress response, but it felt anything but normal to him. "I'll sleep when she wakes up," Marcus replied, and Dr. Mitchell shook her head with the exasperation of someone who dealt with stubborn patients on a daily basis. "She's going to wake up whether you're conscious or not. And, when she does, she's going to need you to be alert and supportive, not a zombie who can barely stand up. Trust me, I've seen this before. The best thing you can do for her right now is take care of yourself." Marcus knew she was right, but the idea of leaving Amira's side felt wrong on a level he couldn't articulate. They had been through something together that had bonded them in ways that transcended ordinary friendship. She had saved his life, and he had witnessed her transformation from invisible civilian to legendary warrior. Walking away now, even temporarily, felt like abandoning her when she might still need his protection. Dr. Mitchell seemed to understand his reluctance. "She's safe here," she said gently. "The Taliban can't reach her, and my medical team is the best in the theater. Nothing is going to happen to her while you get a few hours of real sleep. I promise you that." As if responding to their conversation, Amira's eyes fluttered open. She looked around the room with the cautious awareness of someone who had learned not to trust peaceful moments, then relaxed when she saw Marcus sitting beside her bed. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry from the anesthesia and pain medications. Marcus quickly poured water from the pitcher beside her bed, helping her take small sips until she could find her voice. When she spoke, it was in English, heavily accented but clearly understandable. Marcus realized with surprise that she had been learning the language during her years working at American bases, picking up more than anyone had realized. "My children," she said, her voice hoarse but filled with desperate urgency. "Are they safe?" "They're safe," Marcus assured her quickly. "They've been evacuated to a protected location. The military is taking care of them until you're ready to be reunited." Relief flooded across Amira's face, and she closed her eyes for a moment as if offering a silent prayer of gratitude. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I dreamed about them," she said softly. "Dreamed they were calling for me, and I couldn't reach them. It felt so real." "It was just a dream," Marcus told her. "They're waiting for you, and they know you're safe. The colonel says they're being taken very good care of." Amira nodded, then seemed to notice her surroundings for the first time. The clean white walls, the medical equipment, the American flag visible through the window. She was no longer in Afghanistan, Marcus realized. The helicopter had carried her across international borders to the main American medical facility in the region. "What happens now?" she asked, and Marcus heard the uncertainty in her voice. Everything she had known, her entire life and identity, had been shattered by the events at the compound. She was no longer just a cleaning woman trying to feed her family. She was a hero whose actions had saved countless lives, but she was also a marked woman who could never return to her old life. Dr. Mitchell had been listening to their conversation with professional interest. She stepped forward and introduced herself, then explained Amira's medical situation in terms that were reassuring but honest. The physical wounds would heal completely, but the psychological impact of what she had experienced would take longer to process. "There are people here who specialize in helping people work through traumatic experiences," Dr. Mitchell said. "And there are programs designed to help Afghan allies transition to new lives in America or other safe countries. You have options, and you'll have support whatever you decide to do." Amira absorbed this information with the same focused intensity she had shown during their fight for survival. Marcus could see her mind working through the implications, weighing the possibilities against the reality of her situation. She was no longer making split-second tactical decisions, but she was still thinking like the warrior she had become. "I want to see my children first," she said finally. "Then, we can discuss the future." Marcus felt a smile cross his face for the first time in days. That was exactly the response he would have expected from her, practical and focused on what mattered most. Some things about Amira would never change, regardless of what else had happened to her. Over the following weeks, as Amira recovered from her physical injuries and began the process of adjusting to her new circumstances, Marcus found himself becoming something he had never expected to be. He was her advocate, her cultural interpreter, her bridge between the military bureaucracy and the complex reality of her situation. More than that, he was her friend, bonded to her by an experience that neither of them would ever fully be able to explain to others. The reunion with her children was everything Marcus had hoped it would be. 3 young faces that had existed only in his imagination suddenly became real as they threw themselves into their mother's arms with the desperate joy of children who had feared they might never see her again. Watching them together, seeing the love and relief in their eyes, Marcus understood why Amira had fought so hard to survive. Some things were worth any sacrifice. The media eventually discovered their story, as military reporters always seem to do when something extraordinary happened in a war zone. The headlines wrote themselves: "Cleaning woman becomes combat hero, Afghan mother saves American lives in Taliban attack, from broom to rifle, one woman's incredible transformation." The articles were well-meaning but somehow missed the essential truth of what had happened.
Amira hadn't become a different person during their ordeal.
She had simply revealed who she had always been underneath the quiet exterior that circumstances had forced her to maintain. The courage, the tactical intelligence, the absolute refusal to surrender had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge.
The Taliban attack hadn't created a hero.
It had simply given an existing hero the opportunity to show herself. Marcus returned to active duty eventually, but he found that his perspective on military service had been fundamentally altered by his experience with Amira. He had learned that heroism wasn't the exclusive province of trained soldiers, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. More importantly, he had discovered that the bonds forged in combat could transcend every boundary of culture, language, and nationality. Amira chose to relocate to America with her children, accepting the offer of citizenship that came with her status as a combat veteran. She settled in a small town in Ohio, not far from where Marcus had grown up, and began the long process of building a new life in a country that had once been foreign to her. Her children adapted to American schools with the resilience that children always seem to possess, while Amira herself enrolled in college to study nursing. They stayed in touch, of course. Regular phone calls, occasional visits, the easy friendship of people who had shared something that couldn't be shared with anyone else. Marcus would sometimes find himself thinking about their time together in that burning building, marveling at the twists of fate that had brought them together and wondering what his life would have been like if he had never met her. But, perhaps more than anything else, he found himself changed by the knowledge that heroism could emerge from the most unexpected places. Every time he saw someone being overlooked or underestimated because of their circumstances, he remembered the cleaning woman who had saved his life and the lives of countless others. Every time he was tempted to judge people by their appearance or their job title, he remembered that behind the most ordinary exterior might lurk the heart of a warrior. The official record would show that Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson and Afghan civilian Amira Hassan had successfully defended a forward operating base against Taliban attack, preventing significant casualties and capturing valuable intelligence. But the real story, the story that mattered, was about the discovery that courage and heroism existed wherever people were willing to stand up for something greater than themselves. In the end, that was the lesson that would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives. Not the tactical details of their firefight, not the specific sequence of events that had led to their survival, but the simple truth that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when they chose to be. It was a lesson written in blood and terror, but also in hope and the unbreakable bonds that connected all people who refused to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The broom Amira had been carrying that morning was probably still lying somewhere in the ruins of the compound, forgotten amid the debris of battle. But the rifle she had learned to use with such devastating effectiveness had become something more than a weapon. It had become a symbol of transformation, proof that the most powerful force in any war was the human capacity to rise above circumstances and become something greater than anyone had ever imagined possible.